congratulations to those of you who were here at 9 promptly. We will try to start at 9 promptly. When I was in medical school, there was a professor of surgery, I doubt is still alive. His name was Professor Localio. Can you hear okay? Can you hear? Yeah. And he was the terror of all the medical students because the deal in surgery is that the professor holds up the stitches and the medical student is supposed to cut the thread at exactly 1 centimeter. And so you would go into surgery with Professor Localio and you would cut and he would scream at you, "That's too short." And so the next time you would do it, he said, "That's too long." And so it would go for an hour, you get screamed at, until somebody in my class had the presence of mind to say, "Professor Localio, before I cut the next one, how would you like it, too long or too short?" So here we are. We had a room that was too small. Now we have a room that's too big. And hopefully in another, not next week, but the week after, we will have our own room, which I hope is set to the proportions of the class. And then we will have the 1 centimeter cut, and we'll feel that we're in a home. So we're still in temporary Golos. There were 2 people who participated in the grant. One was in the blog. One was Shira, right? And one was Maria. Okay. So congratulations to the 2 people who found the blog, and you're all invited to see what they wrote. We will deal with the 2 questions that you raised during the class. But where was everybody else? Do you all know how to find the blog? Do you know how to find the blog on the website? Do you know where the classes are on the website? Everybody know where it is? I'm not seeing anybody objecting to it yet.
I made it there, but then I got a little confused because I didn't see any other comments.
Well, the comments are on, in other words, the comments that were made were on lesson number 2, because that was the lesson that we did last week. The comments for this week will be on this is lesson 3. So the comments will be at the bottom, and you'll see the comments that have already been made. And there's a space for a comment. When you type in your comment, there's a black tab that says something in geekish, something that means press this and it'll be entered. And so what we would like to see is from today on, we would like to see about 30 entries in the blog, because it's very important for me as your teacher, because I don't see myself here, just sort of going over information. I consider that this is a learning group, and to hear how we're learning, I need to have people participate, say what they learned, say what they have questions about, and be involved. So what I would like you to try to do is to go in over the end of the week. In other words, today, tomorrow, Friday. Latest entries to the blog should be by Monday night, okay? Because that way everybody has all of Tuesday to read the blog if they haven't read it yet. And that way we can come in knowing exactly where we stand as a group. So that is not optional. It's an integral part of participating in the course, is participating in the blog. Okay? Now, today I'm going to start to tell you about early development and how that relates to families. And in the second class, Barbara is going to start to tell you about a different way of understanding early development, which has to do with attachment. Attachment is probably more familiar to you. What you'll see over the course of our learning is that we want to have multiple voices. What we don't want to do is to figure out who's right? What we want to do is to try to see things from different perspectives. That's what the last 2 classes were about. And that's what the form of the learning is going to be about also. How do you integrate it? Don't try too hard. No one has succeeded, and that's because it's not possible, to my mind. In other words, there are indeed different ways of looking at human experience. Human experience is very complex. The more the merrier. And then the question is really, when do you pick up which thread? When do you say in a session, you say to yourself, I see a problem with attachment. Or, I see something going on here with regulation. That's what we're going to talk about today. That is going to be different for each one of you. So in the blog, we can start to hear about it. In supervision, you'll be talking about it. But what we don't want to do is to say, if we only understood all of attachment, we could strip everything else into attachment. You know, the guys who learn Gemara know that that's not how to do it, right? That it's different voices because they're complex phenomena. And if you learn Chumash, you also see that there's different ways of looking at each pasuk. It becomes richer that way. And the least useful question is who's right. So we're going to start with a way of looking at things which I think may be unfamiliar to you, and that would be good. It begins with, are you able to see? Oh, okay, good. It begins with a seminal article written by a woman I was privileged to be her student, Sybil Escalona. Anybody ever hear of Sybil Escalona? No. Sybil Escalona was one of the great developmental psychologists in America in the 20th century. And she wrote an article which says the following. Here's the baby and there's the environment. What determines the developmental outcome? There's a baby and there's, let's say, the family. Let's say there's the caretakers. Let's say there's the bigger family. There's an environment. What determines the developmental outcome? And what Sybil Escalona tried to explain was that neither by themselves. What happens is the baby and the environment. What?
No, it was off for a second.
I'm sorry.
The mic was off for a second. Back up.
Oh, mic was off?
Your mic now.
Okay, are we okay now?
Yeah.
Okay. We had a better microphone last week. That neither the baby nor the environment by themselves create developmental outcome. Rather, there's something that the baby and the environment create together, and that's called concrete experience. For those of you who like philosophy, you'll understand that this is a direct outcome of the revolution in philosophy of the 20th century that's referred to as phenomenology. Those who want to discuss that will do it in the blog. Concrete experience is what goes on in the world. It's life, how life goes about. And the baby and the environment together create a concrete experience. We're going to be looking at that today in some detail and understanding how the baby contributes its part to concrete experience, how the environment contributes its part, and then concrete experience, that's what determines the developmental outcome. Now, we'll give it some detail, but the basic concept is understandable. In other words, it's not that the environment does something to the baby and then there's a developmental outcome. The environment gives a platform for the baby to do something with the environment. The baby creates a concrete environment interactionally with the environment. That's what's called concrete experience. And so, for those of you, for example, who are interested in sibling studies, it should be perfectly obvious that you can be brought up in the same house and have quite different concrete experiences. Anybody ever talk to their brother or sister about that? Say, wait a minute, were we in the same house? Because that wasn't how it was for me. Well, it shouldn't be, because there is no objective family. There's no objective environment. There's the environment that you interact with and create the concrete experience. Would you call the concrete experience objective? That's a philosophical question, and therefore we'll skip it. But it's an interesting question. The answer is yes and no. In other words, that is as close as we come to what really is important in life. What's outside of us completely, what we don't interact with, is irrelevant to our life. The part that we bring in, the part that we in some ways put in parentheses and interact with, that's what determines our environment. That's the concrete experience. Now, as a result, it's important to add that is there a way that the environment can directly affect the developmental outcome? The answer is no, excepting trauma. That's the definition of trauma. You see, in general, the world comes to us. The environment is the world, right? And the world comes to us and we do something with it. So if there's some unfortunate experience, but it happens slowly enough so that we can take it in and do something with it and give it meaning, then we create a concrete experience out of it. When the missile falls too close to home, too quickly, I haven't done anything with the environment. The environment has done a direct impact on developmental outcome. I wasn't able, that's what's called overcoming the ego, overcoming all of the ego functions. When the environment skips the baby, when the environment doesn't have the baby interacting in the concrete experience, that's the definition of trauma. And it all depends on the thing coming from the environment and the baby's ability to do something with it. There will be children who go to kindergarten, and the other kids are not very nice to them, but they can do something with it. In other words, they can create a concrete experience from that story in Gan and not be directly impacted on it. They can go home and complain to their mother or their grandmother and have a discussion about it. So the concrete experience is not traumatic because they've done something with it. If at the time in the Gan when the other kids are being nasty, the child is overwhelmed for reasons that have to do with what the child is bringing to the interaction, and the child cannot create a concrete experience out of it, you'll end up with a bullying experience, you'll end up with a trauma, and it will be experienced in a different way.
Even with the missile, obviously different people deal with that differently. So would that also then mean that even when you skip the baby, the result of what happens to that person is based off of what they're bringing to the table? Different people deal with trauma in different ways.
Right. The question is, what about the missiles? Also, babies interact differently with missiles. We'll get to that in just a minute, and you'll see that if we're dealing with the small children, it's not the child by itself who's dealing with creating the concrete environment, the concrete experience. It's the children who are in the home. For example, in the first Gulf War, people remember the first Gulf War? That was the one where supposedly we're going to get chemically attacked. And we weren't. And we had children who were traumatized in the South. No missiles in the South. Well, officially no missiles in the South anyway. Not in that part. But we had children who were traumatized. Why? Because there was an alert. And the family created a traumatic experience by being overwhelmed by what might happen. And at the time, they couldn't test reality because there wasn't any reality. There weren't any missiles. There were just these things that you're supposed to respond to. And so we had some kids who, without the physical missile, ended up with a trauma. So it'll depend. David.
I think that there's no question that, like you're saying, that it could be affected without any real cause. But like Rieman's saying, if there are missiles, there will be different reactions.
There'll be different reactions to
and
different missiles.
If it's coming straight from the environment to the developmental outcome, why are there different outcomes?
The question is if the environment is interacting directly, because the missile is not the entire environment. The environment is the child's family who interacts with the missile, and so. For example, in my family, in '91, we had 3 small children. So as we went into the miklat, and we put on gas masks. That's a pretty crazy scene, putting gas masks on together with your kids in a closed space. We would do a raspberry to Saddam Hussein. We did something. And that made it seem funny, and it seemed less overwhelming. And doing something is but that's part of the environment. Right? It's not just the alert or the missile, it's also the environment. Sometimes the environment can't help to mediate, and sometimes the environment is what creates the trauma. I gave you the example of missiles. If there's sexual abuse in the family, then you get into a situation where it's highly likely that the child doesn't have a mediator because the mediators are becoming traumatizing, and so the environment is going to have a direct developmental outcome because the child's ego is overwhelmed by what's going on. Were there questions on the left side of the room? Yeah.
So when you say developmental outcome, are you talking about psychiatric problems? Are you talking about cognitive development?
The question is, what do I mean by developmental outcome? Yeah, it's a good question, Maria, because often in the literature you'll see that what's a developmental outcome? Something that you can stick into DSM-5. or 6, or God help us 7. You know, you guys have a long life ahead of you, so you'll be probably seeing DSM-8, which will be much worse. That's a ridiculous way to do a study, because developmental outcome is about how the child's developing. Developing doesn't mean you have a symptom, you don't have a symptom. It could be, for example, you're more robust or less robust. You tend to avoid things or you don't. Things that can't be measured by symptoms. So developmental outcome deals with the whole person. And in therapy, we try, after all, what do we try to do? To help people to become as much themselves as they can. Okay, so let's look at this in the most challenging slide you're going to see. Take a deep breath. We'll get through it. By the way, I'd like to let you see the books that we deal with. Just pass it. This material, were you able to read it? It's from a very important book, published in 1985 by Daniel Stern. Daniel Stern, Zal, he died a few years ago, was one of the great investigators of child development in the West. He was in America, then he was in Geneva. It helped his thinking to be not in America. And Daniel Stern was the first person who said, if I want to study how a baby develops, let me put the baby and the mother in front of a video camera and let's do microanalysis. Let's take it 1/10 of a second by 1/10 of a second and see what the small nuances are. There were a couple of other people doing it. Nobody did it as well as Dan Stern. And as a result, he started to see patterns of interaction. He started to see games. He started to see dances that babies do. And if you think about it, what he's looking at is a way of looking at concrete experience. Concrete experience is what the baby creates with its environment, right? It's not the environment, it's the experience that the baby creates with the environment. And he suggested the following way of looking at it. Should we turn the lights back off? Can you see it? Okay, with the lights on. Turn the lights off. You turn the lights off. Who turned the lights on? Whoever turned the lights on, turn them off. They turn themselves on. That's the environment. That's not the concrete experience, because we weren't discussing it, but the lights just turn themselves on. So we're going to save electricity too. If we start, you see, we have 3 realms. We have the realm of a concrete experience, and we have the realm of the inner representation. Inner representation means not just memory, as I'll explain to you in a minute. It's the inner world that the child creates based on the interaction with the outer world. So let's say we start with activity number 7. The baby is, a week or 2 old, and arbitrarily we're saying this is the 7th. It's obviously the 7 millionth, but let's call it number 7. And the activity is something that goes on with the baby and the mother. For example, the baby looks at the mother, and the mother is fully available to look at the baby, and she makes some noises, and the baby seems to express some pleasure. Let's take a good interaction for a change. We'll deal with Saurus most of the course, so let's start with something good. Mother is free, fully available, well-fed, well-rested. Sounds like science fiction. In other words, grandma was around, and things are being taken care of. And we have this tiny little interaction. Now, the baby looks for the mother makes a noise. The baby is a week old. Does the baby recognize the mother's voice at a week old? The answer is yes. When does the baby recognize the mother's voice? What's that? In utero, right. The last trimester is the time to sing to your baby. The last trimester is the time to give a baby experience of hearing mother's voice. The acoustic system in the womb is excellent. It's not like this microphone. And so the baby's hearing and you can see that babies respond to sounds that they're familiar with. How do we know that a baby is responding to something that's familiar with? The answer is boredom. What does that mean? That if you take a new stimulus, you put something the baby is unfamiliar with, a baby's heart rate will go up. If you show a baby or present to a baby a stimulus that the baby is familiar with, the heart rate goes down. If you think about it, they would say, like kids say, that's boring. I've already been there, done that. The heart rate goes down. Now, that happens to be, that apparently was created for scientists because there's no other way to study babies. But that's a hard fact. When the heart rate goes down, the stimulus is recognized. And you can see that a baby's heart rate in utero will decrease when it's hearing a sound that it's familiar with. So now the mother makes a sound, and the baby is looking at the mother, and the baby is synthesizing together a sound that's familiar with a face that is becoming familiar. And so mother's face tends to be the first recognizable face because it already has the sound. The soundtrack came first, then the film goes on, but you've already heard the soundtrack. It's like, playing music you're familiar with as the movie's starting. And so the baby, sees the mother's response, hears the mother's response, and seems to give a sign of being happy. So that happened in the interactional experience, right? That's outside, but it's not entirely outside. It's an interactional experience. That's activity number 2. And number 7. The baby has an active memory. Now, what does that mean? First of all, memory. There have been 7 interactions before that, so the baby 6 interactions before that, so the baby has a memory of what has gone in the 6 prior interactions with the mother, right? So why do we call it active memory? We call it active memory because our memory is never like the computer. The computer stores data that you put into it. Primitive computers. The closer you get to artificial intelligence, the more you realize that you can't depend on information. Information is a platform for thinking. And information for the baby is a platform for the baby creating a memory. How can you demonstrate that? You take a baby and you show them one set of forms, gross kinds of forms, like let's say an inverted V. And then you show them a V on the side, right? So when you show them the inverted V, they recognize it. You show them the one on the side, and they recognize it, but they've never seen the V, the usual way we would write it. And then you show the baby a picture that has a V that they've never seen before, and the baby's heart rate goes down. In other words, the baby has created an active memory of something they've never seen. We all walk all the time with active memories of things that have never happened. Memory is not a reliable, it's not supposed to be a reliable set of details of what happened. We're always adding to it what has never happened. And so the baby has an active memory of the 6 previous interactions. You with me? Okay? And that is now called one of the great clumsy terms of developmental theory, the RIG, right? The baby has an RIG of 1 to 6. The RIG is the inner representation, generalized. The G is for generalized. The baby has had representations of things that actually happen and generalize them into this understanding of what happened and what's around that didn't exactly happen. It was close to what happened. And based on that, the baby now has what's called an evoked companion. You see, there's the objective mother. But a mother, not just a mother, but a mother is never an objective piece in the world. Our experience with others is never objective in the sense that it is what it is and you're not interacting with it. Based on the previous 6 interactions and based on the generalization from what had happened in those interactions, the baby has a memory that he can evoke of mother. Is it the mother? Is just the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 together? No. the baby has generalized the inner representation and now has created his or her own mother. The evoked memory is the mother that's the result of these generalizations. You see how the baby's being active? You see how the baby just, looked at mom and she smiled and gave a little sound and the baby was happy. That's not an objective interaction. It's an activity that's interactional that then becomes generalized, and the baby will create out of the generalizations a mother which is not exactly the mother that's out there. You can film that mother, but that's not the baby. That's not the mother that's in the baby's mind. And now, this evoked companion that the baby has had from interactions 1 through 6, which, let's say, did not ever include mother making a noise. Let's say up until now, mother had looked, and maybe she looked more tired. This was the first night she had a decent night's sleep, and now she's smiling more robustly, and she makes a noise, and the baby recognizes the noise. So this interaction, now the baby will compare with the evoked companion that the baby has had before. In other words, the baby will take the generalizations, make it into an evoked companion, and compare it with what's now happened, which is something new, right? And as a result, what's going to happen? The baby's evoked companion is going to start to change, and so after the evoked companion is going to change, what's going to happen in the next interaction with the mother? Now these things are happening all the time. We haven't stopped life. We just stopped looking at life for a moment, right? But the baby is now not just getting some goodies from mother. That's an interesting way to look at a baby as sort of being nobody. Just pour things into. A baby from the beginning is not nobody. From the beginning, the baby is active and has this active way of representing things, has a active evoked companions. That's what it does with the environment to create the pattern of concrete experience. And each time something new happens, the baby then interacts in a different way to the mother as she continues to interact with the baby. Does this all make sense to you so far? Okay. Now this was.
Sorry, I just
Yeah.
want to make sure I'm following. So the baby, every experience with the mother, the baby is adding to its memory that is bringing up to the next experience. So it's not just experience the mother, what is going on right now, as if the baby's a blank state, but it works with its memory with this experience.
The question is, you mean to say that the baby's actually working with the interactions with mother and creating new memories, which are not only the memories of what happened. That's exactly the point. The evoked companion is the mother that the child has created out of the environment.
Because the baby is coming with its previous experiences, so it just doesn't add up to what it really is going on now.
Because the baby has the previous experiences which it generalized, right? That's the evoked companion.
What does it mean generalized?
Generalized means that it doesn't just register exactly 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It added something to it, which is a generalization.
With each interaction with the mother or with each interaction with the world?
Well, is it with the mother or with the world? Right, let's stay with the mother. The world is a big place, we'll get to it. But let's stay with the mother. So the mother, the baby is now looking from its generalization of what's happened before. In other words, what the baby remembers is partly what happened and partly what the baby added to what happened. That's the important mother for the baby. That's the evoked companion. And when that evoked companion is compared to what's happening now, then the baby can generalize and have a new RIG. We had RIG 1 through 6. Now we have RIG 1 through 7. Now, RIG 1 through 7, is that, would you call RIG 1 through 7, would you refer to that as RIG 1 through 6 plus this new interaction? No, that's the whole point. We have a whole new generalization. The baby uses what it has as a evoked companion, adds to it what's new in this new interaction, and now has a whole different generalization. How different? A little. But it's a little different. And so the evoked companion for the next time is going to be different. In other words, the baby's actually always creating a generalization of his experiences, and that's the inner
All
world.
experiences together and making something from it?
All the experience together making something. Yeah, I mean, what we're doing here is this is what's called a simple system. We just took the mother and the baby for a couple of seconds, right? Just to try to think it through. You can see that, you know, the mother's there and her mother is there, and there's something else going on somewhere. It's complicated. So a lot of things are happening differently. But the model, it would be the same. It's just, you know, many more things added into it. The model is what's important here. Yeah.
Is there more?
Avital, what?
Is there more? Or
Oh yeah, there's more.
okay. Well, maybe just to clarify what I'm getting so far, I think it is very interesting to recognize that from birth, or maybe even before, you're saying that there's this active, very active process that's constantly happening, not consciously, right? And that is what's becoming the concrete experience, like that understanding of the world.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, so that was just a summary of what we've been saying?
Yeah.
Okay, and so I won't repeat it. I hope it got into the microphone because it's better than what I said, but that's the point. Yeah, you saw it though.
This process also includes...
I'm sorry.
This process also includes the fact that the infant has a way of interpreting the same exact stimulus based on its own nature, right? Not every, you can have the same exact experience, same exact interaction theoretically, but the nature of the infant is different and interpreted differently.
Right. The question is, what if the environment tries to regulate itself and just repeat itself? But the baby is bringing something different to the environment. So actually, it's never the same. In other words, every interaction is going to be different in the sense that it's going to be compared with something that the baby is bringing to it.
And every baby, and two babies won't be the same either.
Two babies won't be the same, even if they're twins. Right. I can vouch for that. I have a twin. Two babies will not be the same, even if they have a twin. And you see what happens is, let's say we have 30-odd people that are sitting here in the class. The concrete experience, I'm the environment. I don't like to be environment. Here I'm the environment, right? So I'm talking and you're listening. You think anybody is thinking the same thing here? Right? Everybody's bringing different experiences, different thoughts, different things that they've learned or that they think they've learned, and a little bit of, wait a minute, does that refer to me? Does that refer to my baby? Is that what happens with us? And that's going to be different for everybody. As a result, what you have is something that's very complex. Now, the fact that it's very complex doesn't mean that you can't work with it. Sometimes what happens is you start to see complexity and you say, well, it therefore has no meaning. It's just chaotic. It's too complex. But if you think about yourselves, what is this all about? This is about working with people, right? So when you are talking to a client, something very rich is happening in the client and something very rich is happening in you, right? Because the client is bringing up all sorts of evoked memories that you are having of not just the client, but maybe some other people. And so there's something very rich that's happening in the middle, and that's what makes it interesting. It makes it challenging, but it makes it something that's irreducible to simple formula, right? In other words, if you just look at this by itself and say, wait a minute, so two people are sitting in a room talking to each other, it's apparently so rich that there isn't a simple model to say, and that's what's happening. And you see, that's why we had the multiple functions from before, because it's happening on many levels, on different directions of expressing or restraining it, and so it's very rich. How on earth does it work? Not by models. It works between people. That's what works. And then after it works, you think about it. And when you think about it, you reduce it to, I think that client reminded me of my cousin, or I think I reminded the client of her mother. You think about these things. Is that going to give you the ultimate reduction to what really happened? Not even close, right? But we use some of these models to help us to sort out what we think was important. But it ends up being something that you can never get a full reading. So the point is not to try to get a full reading, but to move with it and see what, as we talked about last time, what wasn't moving starts to move. That's what we want to see. So, yeah. Just a second. Am I going in the right direction here? So let me just finish this. So you see that we get to activity number 8. The baby and the mother were doing things, and the mother sneezed. The mother sneezed, the baby did this. That's a moral response. Babies up until about 2 months have a moral response. Newborns have it. They check that to make sure the nervous system is working. It's just a total body startle. So the baby has the hand goes out like this, and it goes back like this. So it's called the moral response. So baby does this moral response. Now, there we have an unplanned activity, but it's going to have to get integrated, right? By doing the generalization, we're integrating things. We're not leaving them by themselves. And then, probably the mother will say, "Oh, you got scared," and so forth. It goes on. There was one more question? Yeah.
Yeah, when you described active memory, you were talking about the beats. So that was your way of describing that the generalization, that inner representation that you have, which is more general, that you then apply to the baby. Is that what you did?
The question was, what is this generalization in the memory?
No, you described active memory with the bees.
I'm sorry, I can't hear.
The bees sideways and then...
Oh yeah, that's an example. It's not a very good example, but it's just to give you the example. These are experiments that, if you're interested, we're now more or less closing a half a century of fascinating research on infants. And in the infant research, one of the things that is done is that you take partial forms, you show them to the baby till the pulse goes down. Then you show them something related to the partial forms, but not that they've ever seen. No artificial things that they would have never seen. And the pulse goes down. So that means that the baby is doing something other than just recognizing what has already come. It's generalizing. That's the basic point. So now, some of you have already asked yourselves, wait a minute, you mentioned grandma. So this isn't just about the baby. Let me just say one more thing first. You see, in this, if we look at the general map, you see that the meanings that we talked about are happening in different places. The sense of self is what I carry with me that I've generalized from the interactions. That's where the sense of self is. It's this generalization about interactions, right? Not about just me, about interactions. And those interactions that I've had with the world, that's where the sense of self is expressed. With another person, right? The pragmatic meaning that we talked about last time, things that go on in the world, the pragmatic meaning is what then happens in the next activity, right? So let's say after the mother sneezed, then mother's trying to make the baby quiet down, but the baby is unhappy, and the mother doesn't quite know, and she seems to be a little anxious about what she's going to do. She's a Jewish mother. She's deeply guilty about that sneeze, right? So that sneeze is never going away. What can you do about that sneeze? It's worse than a missile, a mother sneezing, right? So what you're going to create is, in the pragmatic meaning, there's going to be a pragmatic meaning to something as simple as a sneeze, because there's a muddle going on that now, from being a confident mother who knows how to coo with the baby, you have a mother who's anxious about how to quiet the baby down. So that's a pragmatic meaning of that sneeze. And in the middle, what you have when the baby is comparing what goes on with the mother, you have what's called a regulatory self-object. Now, to talk about regulatory self-objects, we need to talk about self-objects. And I think that is the next slide. Yes. You see, psychoanalysis began with the extraordinary intuition that the human psyche, the human expression of emotion and feeling and thinking is more complex than it seems. And not all of it, and actually not a lot of it, is under our direct control. That was Freud's insight. And he basically spent his time looking at adults, not at babies, and trying to assume that the other person is a separate person with a sense of self, and I'm a separate person with a separate sense of self, and then we talk about meanings, right? And then one of the people in the generation, or two generations after Freud, he wasn't Freud's direct student, a psychoanalyst in Chicago named Heinz Kohut, was born in Vienna. That's already Yichus and psychoanalyst, but he was in Chicago. He met Mr. A, and he was explaining to Mr. A why, you see, the way you're talking to me is that you're angry with me, and that has to do with what we've talked about in the dreams, about your struggle with your father. And Mr. A started to close down. So, being a good analyst, Kohut said, listen, you're resisting this. You see, it's an important interpretation. We're getting to an insight about you and your father, and that's why you're closing down. And Mr. A started to get red. And so Kohut said, now your body is speaking your resistance. This is sort of paraphrase. Your body is speaking your resistance. You are struggling with me now the way you had this trouble struggling with your father. And Mr. A fragmented. He wasn't able to speak. He wasn't able to think. He, in colloquial terms, fell apart. Kohut took a deep breath and said, I am terribly sorry. I have missed the point. I hadn't realized that for you at this moment, it's not my interpretations that you need. The function that I have for you at this moment is that I keep you afloat. I've become the air that you breathe. I've become what makes yourself able to hold together. And when you felt, when I spoke to you about your father, that I was no longer helping you to be coherent, like, sorry to sound bad, that I was no longer helping you to hold yourself together. You felt that I had left you. You felt that I had stopped admiring you and talked down to you with this interpretation. And naturally, your entire self fell apart. That's the first part of the interpretation. And that is true, said Kohut, of all of us. All of us begin needing someone else to be the air that we breathe. We don't breathe the air by ourselves in our souls. We all need someone else who helps us to keep ourselves afloat, who's the glue that makes us coherent. And those others we experience as part of ourselves. And so you had a bad experience way back when, which we'll remember as much as we can about, but when you felt that I wasn't admiring you the way a mother admires a baby. See, when a mother says, you are wonderful, no, you know, objectively, babies are not wonderful. But there is no such thing as an objective baby, and there's no such thing as an objective mother, right? But when a mother says, you are wonderful, it's not the content. It's the experience that mother is part of me and gives me value. Later on, when the child can say about his father, my father is wonderful, and he lets me be part of him. So that's a different kind of self-object, that my father lets me be wonderful the way I think that he's wonderful. We do it together. And the other kind of self-object is a merger, that me and you are just the same. As long as I can see myself in the mirror through somebody else who's just the same, that makes myself coherent. Without some function like that, which is called the self-object function, everything falls apart. It's not a content. Now, that's where the word self-object comes from. Was that clear enough? This was Kohut in 5 minutes. You can imagine, somebody will probably say to me, well, why did you put that in the chart? You know, there's the ego, and there's the drives, and the ego, and the superego, and the things that repeat. Why didn't you say that the issue of being self-object is also in the chart? And the answer is time, that's all. Add it into the chart. as we would say, "Ein Lochei Nami," put it in the jar. That what's going on in the world has meanings in terms of self as well. The value of the multiple function chart that we made is you can add anything you want to it. That was just what was available in 1930. And Kovetz wrote the major work on this in 1971, so 40-year span. So you can say, well, so there's no real such thing as a self without self-objects. Over time, other people who are significant become more or less internalized, more or less. If it's been really good, they're more internalized. If it's been really bad, they're not so internalized, right? If it's been really good, then the person who sits with Kohen, and Kohen says, there, you see, this is about your father, then the coherent self that's sitting next to him can say, thank you for that insight. That really fits with what I dreamed, now I remember another dream. And the work goes on. If the person really bad, then when the person gets this insight, he can't hold the insight because he's feeling criticized by somebody who he needs to feel admired by, and he falls apart. So all of our clients will be on the spectrum in terms of what we call the ability to maintain coherence of the self, not of the ego, of the self, right? And this is what was the beginning of what's called self-psychology, was self-psychoanalysis in America. And Daniel Stern simply took it back into the laboratory. You see, when he says that the mother is a regulatory self-object, he suggested that there are two different levels of self-objects. There's the first self-object, which is a regulation, and the second one, which we'll get to probably next week, the intersubjective one. So now, if we look at the scheme that we've had so far, and remember that in the interaction with the environment, there's more than one player. When the baby is dealing with the mother, guess what? The mother has a bunch of representations of interactions that she's generalized. Which would those be? Those would be the internalized representation she brings with her of herself as a baby with her mother, herself with other people, herself with her spouse, herself with all the important people in her world. So it's pretty complex. In other words, the mother is bringing a whole. In other words, the mother has an evoked companion also. And the evoked companion that the mother has for the baby has to do with how it was with my firstborn, how it was with the second. This one's different, or better, or whatever. This one reminds me of that one. This one reminds me of myself, and so forth. So what you have is a mother and a baby who are creating things out of the internal worlds that each of them have created for themselves. That should be pretty clear, right? But in addition, the mother is, as I kind of suggested, not living by herself right now. We have all these other RIGs, and we have a real mother in the world. There she is. And the real mother in the world now gets a telephone call from her mother. She gets an SMS from her sister. She gets from another sister, from another child, and she's waiting for a message from her husband. So this is a practical mother, right? Now, is how that practical mother living in her family system, pragmatically, is that going to affect how she is available to smile at the baby who smiles at her? And how, right? So now you see that the mother, who's this regulatory self-object, who is able to create the coherence of the self by giving coherent regulation to the baby, may or may not succeed based on whether it's been a good night, based on who else she's interacting with, And that mother who's sitting there interacting with the baby, and her mother is saying to her, this is a special time, I'm going to take care of the other 8. And her husband brings her a cup of tea with exactly the amount of sweetener she likes. And the other children are not screaming and yelling, but they're letting her, be with this baby the way she was with them. It's going to go well, right? It's going to be a situation where all of that support that the mother's getting is going to be poured into this interaction that the baby's having with the mother. But if grandma is saying, look, I'm tired now, it's my turn to go to sleep, and so you have a couple of other things to do, and 3 other children are crying, and dad is saying, I would make them something to eat, but I don't know where the refrigerator is, and it's not a good memory. So this is not going to work well. I mean, for Superwoman it'll work well, but for many women it won't work well. And then what will the baby experience? The baby will experience that mother's not there for me. The baby will experience a mother who, give you an example, when dad is around, it works less well. When dad isn't around, it works better. Or the opposite, right? Or when grandma is around, it works better or worse. And so all of these different interactions, which are known as family, right? The interactions that the mother is having with all these different people in her family, all of those interactions are going to turn into the interaction. They're all going to be spilled into what the interaction is, and the baby's going to take that interaction and turn it into the next RIG, right? The baby's going to take this, and as a result, for example, if you see that mother does better when dad is not around, the baby's, if that happens a lot, the baby's going to start to feel that I need to be not around dad. Is the baby going to be able to explain that? No. But it's going to become an evoked memory. And there's going to be a sense that when he comes through the door, things start to disintegrate. And my sense of self and my sense of the mother's regulating me gets disturbed by her needing to regulate somebody else. Or the opposite, that when mom is by herself without dad, she just, is overwhelmed, and I need to do something to get her to bring that in, because whatever I do that brings that in makes her a better regulator. Okay? So there's no way to distinguish, if you look at it. You can't cut it. That's the whole point of this. That you have these concrete family experiences, the mother and all of her past relationships and all of her present relationships are being spilled into the sense of self of the baby. So it's not that the baby has his inner world and there's the family out there. Through the continuous interactions and how they work, because of the function of self-object, that the baby experiences the mother as part of the self, the whole family dynamic is going to turn into part of the baby's sense of self. Okay? So now, let's just see if we can go one step further. You can probably figure out where that fits, right? In what we saw about multiple function in the area of reality. But you see, the area of reality here is not just what happens, but also the way the sense of self is developed. I'll just show you one picture for a moment. This is a picture, a painting by somebody named Orchardson. Orchardson was an impressionist, and he painted this in 1980. Manet had good things to say about Orchardson. He was in Scotland, and this is in Edinburgh, the very extraordinary painting. And what do you see here, close up? Well, you would expect that the baby, we don't know if it's a boy or a girl, but Scotland, the men dress differently, so let's say that it's a boy. So the boy and his mother are interacting, but it's not face to face. We're not used to that, right? We think that things are always mothers face to face. But here, this is within the first year, and the infant, the mother's looking at the baby's face, but the infant is looking at the mother's hand and the extension of her hand in the fan that she's holding. And so what the mother is doing is regulating the child's attention. And that's exactly what in the first about a year, let's say, and goes on, certainly the first 9 months, that the mother regulates the baby's hunger. The mother regulates the baby's ability to be soothed, but she also regulates his affect, because if he's smiling and she smiles back, he'll smile more and she'll smile more, and then it'll explode into, a wonderful, robust smile. And she can make him interested by hiding and, playing cuckoo, hide and seek, and she can get his attention, and she regulates him in the sense that what she does, he experiences as part of himself, because she's a regulatory self-object. So it's not just that she does it, but how she does it. And he experiences it as part of herself. But she has a plan. She wants him to stop being hungry. She wants him to stop crying. She wants him to be happy. She wants him to be interested. So what happens in the regulatory stage of the self-object is, which we could call either the regulatory self-object or the realm of the hand, if you wish, is that the role of the mother is that she acts on the baby. The mother doesn't do the baby. That's in the interaction out there in the interactional world. And the results, though, are poured into the self. You see, from what we saw before, because how she's doing it and what she's doing, that turns into my representations that are generalized, and my evoked companion, what I expect of the world, the way I think things are going to go. And a good example is security. We have this clavicle. The clavicle makes it such that we are not able to hug ourselves. Right? If we didn't have a clavicle, we could. That would be very bad. But we have a clavicle. And because we have a clavicle, we can't hug ourselves. We need a hug from somebody else. So to feel security of being hugged, you need mother. Right? And when mother wants to give that sense of security, she hugs the baby. And that is felt by the baby as my security. It's inside myself. It comes from the mother. So it's a regulatory self-object. She's a self-object who regulates me. And so at that point, what I want to do now, just to stay with our time, is we're going to break up into gender groups. And we're going to do the following. As you know, the first 10 minutes you talk in dyads, about something that I'll tell you about. The second 10 minutes, you talk about what it was like to talk about that. And the last 10 minutes are about what we learned together in the small group. And then we come back, and then there'll be time for the questions or whatever. If not,
Just
yeah.
hear the last part of what you said.
I'm sorry?
I didn't hear the last part of what you said. The mother hugs the baby because she herself wants to feel her.
Why does the mother hug the baby? No, the mother is, well, in the real world, the mother wants a hug. But what we're talking about is from the point of view of the baby, the mother sees that the child is a little bit unsettled and gives the baby a hug to give him a sense of security. Does the mother need to hug at that moment for herself or not? That's connected to all the other people, right? If she's getting enough hugs in her world, then that hug is special for the baby. If she's getting no hugs in the world, then her hugging the baby may be contaminated, in other words, influenced by her fact that she needs the baby, the hug, and the baby may be getting hugs that the mother needs and the baby doesn't need. And then you'll get a confused baby if that keeps happening. But what I said was on the good side, that she wants the baby to be secure. So for the first 10 minutes, we're going to tell each other in groups of a time when I felt, anytime, upset, and who helps me to calm down. Just a little vignette. 2 stories. Tell it, when you're listening, you say, wait a minute, I want to get the picture right, and where was the other person? And so, get a concrete experience of what happened. make those stories, spend 10 minutes about what it was like to talk about being regulated, not what we usually talk about. And then we'll try to think what we learned from it, and we'll meet back at precisely 10:30. What would you like to share from one group to the other group? What's appropriate for you to for the women's group, what is it you would like to state so the men will hear it? What is it that you would like to state so the women can hear it about what you've learned in the exercise? And if you don't have anything, then I'm just going to keep talking. So you've been warned. Yeah.
Something I shared is that I found it to be very validating in this context to be able to share our experiences and talk about how it touches us, because we're not with clients, we don't have to wait for supervision to discuss those things, and other people seem to.
Okay, that's a very important point. That's why we do the exercises this way. It's something that I learned from Tavistock, essentially. This is available to you all the time. It's not available just in this class. You learn the most in becoming a therapist from your colleagues, from your peers. And the way to do that is to talk, and then talk about what it's like to talk. Because talking about how it is to talk about these sensitive matters face to face, that's where you grow. In that place where you say it's talking, and what is it like to be talking? What's difficult about talking? Everything you do that you find out in what it's like to talk to each other, that will inform you what it's like for your clients to talk to you, and what it's like for you to talk to your clients. Okay, it's a very important technical point about how we do the exercise, right? I would never want, if you think about it yourselves, would you want to do an exercise and not metabolize it? In other words, not to think face to face, how was this for us? It'd be something that would be artificial, that in some ways you're dealing with the external world, hearing stories, but not about metabolizing the internal world, not about going through what the experience of hearing a story or telling a story, what is it like and what happens between us. Okay? Yeah.
I think what I really like is that in general, as therapists, we're really introspective and we're self-aware and growth, and it's like such an amazing thing that, everybody is very like-minded in that sense, especially.
That everybody what?
That everybody is like-minded, like they want to grow, they want to be introspective,
Right. Wonderful. So Esther is telling us that we were starting to become a learning group, so I'm going to exploit that to say, and when we start to read and write the blog, then we're really going to become a learning group. But this course is not about information. It's about, you can't become a therapist without changing. And as you'll see, we'll describe it over time, when you sit in a room with a client, a family or even an individual, and something happens, we want something to happen, right? But who is it supposed to happen? It doesn't happen just to the client. If it happens only to the client and you say, well, that was indifferent, I just applied a tool, you're not in this course at least, in this course. If it hasn't happened to you, it hasn't happened to them. And if something happens to you, it's a good sign that something happened to them even though they're not telling you. So that's part of, we take upon ourselves to grow. We take upon ourselves, this isn't just professional. If it's not personal, it isn't the right profession, right? Okay. David.
I think one of the things that some of us found was that we turned towards mentors and maybe rabbinical figures that we look up to as opposed to maybe parents or something like that. And we were wondering if that's a similar experience on the other side of the mechitza, or if they had other experiences, let's say outside parents.
Marvelous. That's a marvelous cross-gender question. The men found out that sometimes that function of self-object, the regulating self-object, that the people that we turn to are sometimes male authority figures, male support figures like rabbis. And that raises the question, and how about women? If it's not, intimate in the family, who are the other figures that might show up other than in the family? Anybody want to say something about it? Crazy.
Friends.
friends, sisters, mothers, therapists. What's that? Husband. You heard the last one? Husbands. Rebbitzins? Maybe a little less. Okay.
I think there's a difference between cognitive, like understanding something, and emotional regulation. So when you want to talk, when you have something to ask cognitively, a question, then it doesn't necessarily regulate you emotionally. You're talking about a relationship that regulates, right? Like a mother and a child. So that wouldn't be something that I would want to, with my brain, understand, but something that emotionally I want to experience.
Okay, so is he saying that would be the self-object function is separate from the function of cognitive understanding, and therefore you would then enlist a teacher or somebody that's involved cognitively. Okay. Yeah.
Right, like I think it's separate. Like if it's just like nerves or emotions about something that's like not a topic to you in terms of friend or parent. If it's like a shkafic situation, and turn more into like guidance or
I'm having trouble hearing you. I may be the only one not hearing you, but I didn't hear it very well.
I'm saying in terms of regulation, I feel like it's a difference if it's just emotional regulation or it's need regulation and clarity, guidance.
Okay, the question is what kind of regulation we're talking about.
Right.
The kind of regulation we're talking about in this particular class is regulation of self, right? In other words, it's a sense that somebody helps you to pull yourself together, to feel coherent in yourself, and to feel that that things are working together. Maria?
So my particular example I was sharing with Michaela, although we were both saying we turn to our husbands and we share things.
I missed the sentence.
Although generally we were both saying that we share things with our husbands and they're generally quite empathetic, but my particular example, it wasn't going to help him listening because he's not going to get it, because it was more of a thing that I had to go to a friend about. It was something that only a good female friend was going to be able to validate me and empathize.
Okay, so Maria's making an important question about the variations in self-objects, and particularly variations in gender and relationships, that for some women, anything that a woman says here will say it's true for some women, but men say it'll be true for some men. None of it will be true for all men or all women. That for some women, a spouse is part of the panoply of possible self-object for some topics, but not for many topics. And for many topics, a woman friend would be a better self-regulating self-object. And that raises the interesting question for couples, which is it so that being a couple means that you become each other's exclusive regulatory self-objects? Is that the deal in a couple? Is it a good deal? Is it desirable? Is it something that is sustainable? But sometimes there's a fantasy in a relationship that if everything can be solved within a couple, that each can do for the other everything, and that sometimes isn't the most sustainable way of looking at things. Sometimes it's better to understand for each person, each member of the couple, who is in your crowd, who are your people, who are the people that can do things for you that I can't do for you. And that is helpful for the couple, but only if it's recognized. If it creates jealousy or a sense of, failure, that if you go to your girlfriend, it means you don't think your husband is good enough, then we have a couple's problem to talk about. But if each member of a couple can recognize that there are other self-objects out there, and that doesn't mean that the couple isn't working well, it just means that the couple isn't perfect, and go find the perfect couple. So that's a very interesting and important question. It's also true for mothers and children. Sometimes it's true for fathers and sons. that sometimes a mother will want to be the exclusive regulatory self-object, and it's a function that can be spread out. Sometimes it happens with siblings, sometimes it's a favorite aunt, sometimes it's a grandparent who does that function for that particular child better than for someone else. And it will vary. You'll find that one older brother is doing that for one particular younger brother, but not for others. And so the issue for the family is that there are enough regulatory self-objects out there for everything to sort of work, but it doesn't have to be exclusive. And making it exclusive is usually a problem. Sometimes people want to be. It's quite an experience to be a regulatory self-object. But the only person who can make you the regulatory self-object is the person who's looking for it. You can't do it for them. They have to give you the role. Yeah.
So it was interesting what came out for us when we were sharing.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask all the women to scream.
Okay, when we were sharing, I realized that when you look for someone else to regulate, it often depends how much, like on the person that you turn to, how much you let the other person actually regulate for you, or how much you depend on yourself. Like if the other person is very forthcoming and understanding, you tend to, for example, said with husbands, like put everything on them because like they're coming home and like, oh, we had such a hard day. When until now I was totally fine to self-regulate, but depending on who the person is that you turn to, then you'll either more like let him take the role to regulate you, or keep it more to yourself and self-regulate.
Right. In other words, to create a self-object function, it takes two. And it takes two that are available to do it. One to need the function and the other one to give the function. And that isn't always, at every moment, completely available. And so there are frustrations and so forth. And there are certain expectations which are not so realistic. There's a famous psychoanalytic article called, I think it was, I'll give you the reference next week, something about when dad comes home, he's not at his best. You know, with the idea that entering into, you see, the home is kind of a self-object mode, isn't it? Right? You know, when things are going well at home. So people are giving that to each other all the time. That's part of what happens at home. Business world or academic world, not so much, right? So you're in a world that in some ways you have to float. It leaves you very, very dependent and frustrated and not available to give it back. And going from one mode to the other in the situation was described as men coming home from the work day and entering into the home mode. It's like, you know, you have to do a re-entry before you get burned up. You have to do it slowly. You have to, you know, settle in. You have to do some regulations before you can become totally available. Just 1 second. One last question. Yeah.
Question regarding self-object. So if someone, let's say, someone feels angry, so it's possible, I think it's possible that they can sometimes regulate their anger, not with a person, but with something else, like an experience, or let's say someone's is an alcoholic and a drink, and that regulates their anger. So if someone does use, let's say, an actual object as a self-object, not a human being, so does that mean, is that, for example, a self-object? Could that be a self-object?
Can a substance be a self-object? When a substance is a self-object, that is the source of addiction. The person who wrote that was Cohen. Cohen was asked by the Addictions Authority in America in around 1980 to take a look at addictions and self-function. And he wrote a whole book for them, where more or less he said what you just asked, which is that if you make a substance into a self-object, it'll be too good, right? You can, you know, alcohol is you can use marijuana. There's no addiction physically, but you can get used to it. You can turn to something and make it a self-object, but it isn't another person. So it's the most lonely way to do it, and it will reinforce itself. What?
A spouse can also be
I'm sorry?
A spouse can also become an object like that.
A spouse can be an addiction too. Well, we're getting deep into lots of issues that we have 3 years to learn about. We're going to end on time as a way of encouraging you to begin on time. We will see you all in the blogs. Some of the questions that have come up that we didn't finish, write them in the blog. And I just wanted to say to all of you that the staff says thank you to you after the request that I made, that when you leave at the end of a session, you leave the room pretty much the way you found it. The staff has been very happy with the fact that rooms seem to be left in good order. So I'm trying to be a sustaining regulatory self-object for you. When you're leaving the room, you remind yourself that there are people out there that are really grateful when you leave it well. Thank you very much.